Ebony had always been the kind of person who woke up every morning feeling both hopeful and anxious in equal measure. She had dreams of better days ahead, aspirations of one day leaving her cramped studio apartment in the outskirts of Manchester, and a fierce desire to prove herself in a world that often seemed hostile. Her mother had worked two jobs to put food on the table and had always encouraged Ebony to stay strong, reminding her that resilience and kindness would serve her well. That morning, Ebony pulled on her freshly ironed uniform, smoothed down the front of her apron, and looked at her reflection in the tiny mirror beside her front door. Even with all the dreams lodged in her heart, she was determined to be thankful for every small blessing. At least she had a job, a roof over her head, and hope burning in her soul. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. She had landed a position at Pemberton's Diner, a quaint establishment known for its home-style breakfasts and cozy interior. Tucked away near one of the city's bustling streets, Pemberton's Diner was modestly successful. It attracted a variety of patrons: construction workers grabbing an early bite, families trying to keep the kids occupied with crayons and coloring sheets, or old friends reuniting over cups of coffee that somehow always tasted a bit richer there. Ebony had started working at Pemberton's about 6 months ago, determined to make a good impression and keep the paychecks coming. While it didn't pay her enough to live luxuriously, it covered her rent and helped her chip away at some of her debts. She was proud of her ability to provide for herself, and even prouder to be contributing a little money every month to help her younger sister with college expenses back home. However, working at Pemberton's Diner wasn't always a smooth experience. The manager, Troy, was an older man with a hawk-like gaze that often fixed on Ebony with an unreadable glint. There were times she felt his eyes lingering on her when she was speaking to customers or hurrying across the floor to deliver an order. She couldn't quite explain why it made her feel uneasy, but he had never given her a clear reason to trust him. Troy had been with the diner for decades and was rumored to have pulled it out of bankruptcy once before. Though Ebony tried to remain polite and professional, she could never quite shake the feeling that Troy was watching her more closely than any of the other waitstaff. Despite that undercurrent of tension, Ebony poured her heart into her work. She greeted customers with a warm smile, offered suggestions for the daily specials, and treated everyone who walked through the doors with kindness. She kept a mental note of each person's usual beverage preference, and found it rewarding when a regular left with a grin, telling her they'd see her soon. Little gestures like that mattered to Ebony, because she'd grown up understanding how small acts of kindness could shift someone's entire day. If she could lighten someone's burden with a bright smile or a gentle word, she felt her life had purpose. On that particular day, Ebony had arrived early for her shift. She needed to prepare the coffee station and confirm that the sugar caddies were all full, the creamer was stocked, and the counters were wiped down. It was a quiet morning so far, with only a few customers seated in the booths. The smell of bacon sizzling on the grill mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ebony hummed softly to herself, mentally preparing for the rush she expected around noon, when office workers would stream in for their lunch breaks. Then something unusual happened. Ebony noticed a tall figure standing near the entrance, wearing a casual jacket and sunglasses. At first, she assumed he was just another patron hoping to remain incognito. The diner occasionally attracted famous footballers who liked the low-key, down-to-earth atmosphere. Manchester was, after all, home to some of the world's most famous clubs and players. But once this stranger removed his sunglasses, Ebony couldn't quite believe who she was looking at. Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the greatest football players in the world, was standing right there in Pemberton's Diner. His face was unmistakable, though Ebony noticed how he seemed to carry himself with humility. He scanned the room quietly, probably assessing whether it would be safe for him to sit down without drawing too much attention. For a moment, Ebony froze. She felt her heart flutter as she realized just how enormous a star he was. She had watched him on TV countless times, along with her family, cheering and hollering whenever he made a brilliant play. Now here he was, in the flesh, seemingly alone, and just hoping for a quiet meal. Ebony glanced around to see if her co-workers had noticed. A couple of them were in the back, busy with orders, while others were so engrossed in their tasks that they hadn't looked up. Summoning her courage, Ebony stepped out from behind the counter and approached him with a polite smile. She kept her voice soft, wanting to show respect for his privacy. She introduced herself and offered him a booth away from the main area, which she knew would afford him some semblance of seclusion. Ronaldo, appearing grateful, followed her to a corner booth near a window. Ebony handed him a menu, though she suspected he'd likely opt for something simple and healthy. She'd often heard about his disciplined diet. Still, she tried her best to be a good hostess, explaining the diner's specials and quietly reassuring him that she would handle any situation that might arise if someone recognized him. He appreciated her kindness, smiling in a way that made his eyes shine. "Thank you," he said gently. "I just need a place to eat and catch my breath. You're very kind to help me." His voice was calm, his demeanor surprisingly humble. Ebony responded with a nod, letting him know that she would be right back to take his order. She gave him a moment alone, understanding that being in the public eye constantly could be overwhelming. She also wanted to give him the time he needed to decide on his meal without hovering. In the meantime, she went back to the counter to retrieve a glass of water. Her mind whirled, still processing the encounter. She kept thinking about how remarkable it was to see an icon like Cristiano Ronaldo calmly asking for a meal in a modest diner. She took a deep breath to steady herself and reminded herself of her duties, aware that starstruck employees were not exactly what the customers, or her manager, wanted to see. Yet she felt an undeniable excitement at serving one of the biggest names in football. It was a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and she wanted to handle it with grace. When Ebony brought the water to his table, she asked if he'd like to place his order. He requested a simple egg white omelet with vegetables and a side of fresh fruit. Ebony nodded, noting everything down carefully. Before she left to place the order, Ronaldo looked her in the eyes and said, "Thank you for helping me stay out of the limelight. I appreciate it." She felt her cheeks grow warm, touched by his genuine politeness. She whispered, "It's my pleasure," and headed to the kitchen to hand the slip to the cook. While Ebony was busy in the back, Troy emerged from the office. His gaze quickly swept across the diner. It didn't take him long to spot Ronaldo sitting quietly in the corner booth. Ebony, unaware of Troy's presence, was busy confirming that the cook had everything needed to prepare the star's meal exactly as requested. Finally, when she returned to the front of the diner, she found Troy standing there with a frown etched across his face. He glared at her, and Ebony's stomach twisted with a familiar sense of dread. She knew that expression. It was the same scowl he wore whenever he believed a staff member was stepping out of line or acting in a way he disapproved of. "What do you think you're doing?" Troy hissed under his breath, making it obvious he didn't want to cause a scene in front of the customers. Ebony tried her best to remain composed as she explained that a customer had arrived, and she was merely doing her job by seating him and taking his order. Troy's jaw clenched so tightly that she worried he'd break a tooth. "He's not just any customer," Troy spat. "You think you can handle a celebrity like him? You should have told me. Let me handle this. You don't even know what you're doing." Ebony felt her heart skip a beat. She had no clue why Troy was so furious. Surely having a high-profile customer was good for the diner. She struggled to find a polite response, though she managed to say, "I'm just trying to serve him respectfully, sir. He seemed to want a quiet meal." Troy narrowed his eyes. "I don't like you stepping outside your boundaries," he muttered. Before Ebony could say another word, he stormed off, leaving her standing there bewildered and anxious. In the corner, Ronaldo seemed unaware of the tension brewing. Trying to maintain her composure, Ebony continued with her shift. She checked on the other tables, delivered coffee refills, and kept glancing over to see if Ronaldo needed anything. He gave her a small nod of thanks once in a while. Everything appeared smooth on his end, but Ebony could still feel Troy's eyes burning into her back every time she passed by his line of sight. A few times Ebony caught him whispering something to another staff member while glaring in her direction. She could only imagine what accusations he might be leveling at her. It was disconcerting, but Ebony reminded herself that her job was to serve customers, whether they were famous footballers or regular folks. Finally, the omelet and fruit plate were ready. She gingerly carried them to Ronaldo's booth, placing the dishes before him. He thanked her politely and asked for a cup of tea. Ebony smiled, told him she'd be right back, and went to the beverage station. During those few seconds alone, her imagination conjured up countless worries. Had she done something wrong by not alerting Troy? Was the manager trying to find a reason to terminate her? She tried to shrug off the negativity, focusing on the fact that she was doing her job. When Ebony returned with the tea, she noticed Ronaldo observing her with a gentle curiosity. He probably sensed she was upset about something, but was too polite to ask. Their exchange was cordial and brief. She told him to enjoy his meal and that she would be available if he needed anything else. Then she turned to attend to her other tables, her stomach in knots. As she cleared dishes and brought checks to other guests, Ebony worked hard to keep a smile on her face. The last thing she wanted was for any customer to sense that she was distraught. Still, the tension was eating at her. At some point, Ebony felt a tap on her shoulder. Troy stood behind her, a smug look in his eyes. "Come to my office when you have a moment," he said flatly. It didn't sound like a request, it was a command. She swallowed her fear, nodded, and told him she'd be there as soon as she'd dropped off her last customer's check. Once she'd made sure the table was settled, Ebony approached the hallway leading to Troy's cramped office. Her footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, and a chill ran down her spine. Inside that small room, the blinds were drawn and the only light came from a flickering overhead fixture. Troy sat behind his desk, arms folded across his chest. Ebony stood in front of him, her posture stiff with anxiety. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the disdain on Troy's face was more intense than usual. He wasted no time in letting her know how he felt. "You overstepped your role," he said coldly. "Big celebrities come in here from time to time, and I don't want a nobody like you chasing them away with your incompetence." Ebony's cheeks flamed with indignation. She wasn't incompetent, and she certainly wasn't chasing him away. She had done everything possible to make sure Ronaldo felt comfortable and respected, yet she knew better than to argue with Troy when he was in one of his foul moods. She tried to explain, stammering slightly, that Ronaldo had simply walked in, and she'd done her usual routine of greeting and seating a customer. Troy didn't let her finish. "You're not star material, Ebony," he snapped, "and I don't need you to be. All I need is a waitress who knows her place. Next time a celebrity walks in, you call me immediately. Do you understand?" She managed to squeak out a, "Yes, sir," though her throat felt tight. She half expected him to slap her with a warning or cut her hours, but nothing could have prepared her for what he did next. Troy gripped the edges of his desk and leaned forward. "This isn't working out. I've given you chance after chance to prove yourself, but you're just a liability waiting to happen. Consider this your last day. Pack up your things. You're fired." Ebony's ears rang. She could barely comprehend his words. "Fired," she repeated, stunned. "For what? What did I do?" Troy sneered as though the answer should be obvious. "You're disruptive, Ebony. Customers have complained. You're always trying to go above and beyond. This isn't a charity. We run a business, and I won't have you messing with high-profile clients. I'm done. Don't make a scene out there. Just leave your uniform in your locker and get out." He made a dismissive gesture. Ebony's heart pounded so violently she thought she might collapse. She tried one last time to defend herself, but the fury in Troy's eyes silenced her. Overcome with humiliation and disbelief, she turned and left his office. Walking out of that cramped space, Ebony felt like she was drifting in a nightmare. Her breathing grew shallow and she fought the urge to cry. She went straight to the staff locker area, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. She changed out of her uniform, folded it neatly, and placed it on the bottom shelf of her locker. Her mind whirled with the unfairness of it all. She desperately needed this job. Without it, how would she pay her rent? How would she keep helping her younger sister through school? Still, Troy had made up his mind and she knew there was no changing it. Before walking out for good, Ebony took a small peek at the diner floor. Ronaldo was still there, finishing his meal. Ebony couldn't muster the courage to say goodbye or tell him what had happened. She simply slipped out of the building, tears burning in her eyes. The shock weighed heavily on her as she made her way home. The bus ride felt endless. Her thoughts flickered between disbelief, rage, and despair. She replayed the day's events in her mind, searching for a way she could have handled things differently. At one point, she almost convinced herself that maybe she should have let Troy know immediately. Maybe she should have done something to appease his ego. But another part of her fumed. She was fired for doing her job, for being kind to a customer who happened to be a famous footballer. It felt like a grave injustice. Back in her small apartment, Ebony sank onto her worn sofa, burying her face in her hands. She tried to gather the courage to call her mother, but she didn't want to deliver such bad news, especially not knowing how to reassure her that everything would be all right. The harsh reality was that Ebony didn't have a backup plan. She had enough savings to scrape by for maybe a month or two, but after that, she'd be in trouble. Fighting the urge to sink into hopelessness, she told herself she'd wake up early the next day and start job hunting immediately. It was her only option. She had to keep going. That night, Ebony barely slept. Every time she drifted off, she saw Troy's scowling face or the kind eyes of Ronaldo, who probably had no idea of the chaos that had ensued. When the alarm blared the next morning, Ebony turned it off with a shaky hand. Her day lay ahead, blank and uncertain. No job to go to, no uniform to put on. She felt a sting of loss, but also a flicker of resilience. She refused to let one cruel manager's decision ruin her entire life. She dressed in plain clothes, preparing to scour the city for job opportunities. But just as she was about to step out the door, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. Normally she would have ignored it, but something compelled her to pick up. Her voice trembled with curiosity as she answered. To her astonishment, the person on the other line introduced himself as a representative of Cristiano Ronaldo, explaining that the footballer had asked for Ebony's contact information at the diner after noticing how she had vanished in the middle of his meal. Ebony's heart thundered. She could barely believe what she was hearing. The representative told her that Ronaldo had been deeply impressed by her kindness and professionalism. He had asked the diner staff where she was, and another employee finally disclosed that Ebony had been let go. Ronaldo, disturbed and feeling responsible, had decided he wanted to do something for her. Ebony felt tears welling up. She struggled to maintain her composure during the call, forcing herself to speak with clarity. The representative went on to say that Ronaldo wanted to meet her the next day to discuss a potential opportunity, and he gave Ebony an address to a location not far from the city center. After hanging up, Ebony nearly collapsed onto the sofa again, this time from shock and overwhelmed emotion. Ronaldo, the famous football star, wanted to see her, presumably to help after hearing she'd lost her job. She didn't know what to think. Her imagination ran wild, conjuring everything from a job offer to some grand charitable gesture. It felt like an impossible turn of events. Just yesterday, she had been uncertain about her future. Now there was a chance something amazing might happen. Trying to steady her nerves, Ebony realized she needed to figure out how to present herself. The next day, she arrived at the given address in her best outfit, a modest but professional dress that she hoped conveyed her seriousness. The building was a sleek, modern office complex. The lobby was glossy and immaculate, with sleek chairs and imposing glass walls. She approached the reception, gave her name, and explained she had an appointment. Immediately, the receptionist flashed her a smile and directed her to the elevator. Ebony felt her palms sweat as she rode up to the 23rd floor. 1,000 questions raced through her mind. Why had Ronaldo decided to help her personally? What kind of opportunity could he offer? When the elevator doors slid open, Ebony stepped into a sunlit corridor lined with framed photographs of Ronaldo's football triumphs. She stared at an image of him holding a trophy aloft, surrounded by cheering fans. Just as she was about to move forward, a polished-looking assistant beckoned her into a conference room. Ebony entered to find a warm, welcoming space with large windows offering a panoramic view of the city. And there, seated at a long table, was Cristiano Ronaldo himself. He stood up the moment she walked in, extending a hand to greet her. In person, he seemed even more charismatic. His eyes were genuine as he smiled and told her he was glad she could make it. Ebony offered a polite greeting, still overwhelmed by the surrealness of it all. Once she sat down, Ronaldo began by apologizing for what had happened at the diner. He explained that he had asked around when he noticed Ebony was gone, only to discover she had been abruptly fired. Ebony felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she recalled her dismissal. She nodded quietly, admitting she never imagined it would lead to this moment. Ronaldo expressed his belief that kindness and good service should be rewarded, not punished. He said he had been impressed not just by how she had treated him, but by how she handled her other tables, the patience she displayed when interacting with customers, and the respect she'd shown him, offering him a private corner without making a fuss. He then revealed the reason for this meeting. He was looking for someone to help oversee a small charitable initiative he was planning to launch in Manchester, aimed at providing mentorship and job opportunities for underprivileged youths. He needed a community liaison, someone who understood the importance of empathy, diligence and resilience. And something about Ebony's demeanor at the diner had convinced him she might be perfect for the role. Ebony's heart soared at the possibility. She couldn't believe that just yesterday she had been fired for being too accommodating, and now that very trait had caught the attention of one of the world's most famous athletes. Still, she felt a wave of self-doubt. She had never had a high-level position before, never worked in a formal charity setting. Sensing her uncertainty, Ronaldo smiled gently and explained that she wouldn't be doing this alone. She would be part of a team, working with experienced professionals, but she would be the face of the local community outreach. Her main responsibilities would include interacting with families, coordinating youth programs, and ensuring that the initiative was truly serving those in need. Through tears of gratitude, Ebony thanked him for the offer. She admitted she had been terrified about what she would do after losing her job. Ronaldo replied that sometimes life has a strange way of opening new doors when one closes. He also insisted on providing her with a short training course where she could learn about community work, fundraising, and event coordination. Ebony felt an overwhelming surge of relief, gratitude, and excitement. This was everything she'd secretly dreamed of, a chance to do something meaningful while still earning a living. Later that day, Ebony returned home in a state of disbelief. She stared at her reflection in the mirror again, recalling how she had looked at herself just yesterday morning before everything changed. Now her life was on an entirely new trajectory, one she never would have anticipated. The morning after her firing, she had expected to roam the city looking for any job that would accept her. Instead, she found herself stepping into a role with Cristiano Ronaldo's charity project. It was the shock of her life. Over the following weeks, Ebony's life became a whirlwind of introductions, trainings, and planning meetings. Ronaldo's team guided her through the basics of community outreach, from drafting proposals to managing volunteers. Ebony was a quick learner, fueled by her passion for helping others. She found her life had purpose in ways she'd never experienced while waiting tables. Every day brought new challenges, new faces, and new stories. From the single mother who needed after-school programs for her children, to the teenage boy who dreamed of playing football but lacked proper training or gear, Ebony began to see how big the need was and how impactful this new initiative could be. Ronaldo would occasionally pop into the office, though he was often traveling for matches and training. Each time he visited, he made a point to check on Ebony's progress, ensuring she felt supported. He praised her for her compassion and genuine interest in helping people. She no longer felt like she was living in someone else's story. For the first time in her life, Ebony sensed that she was exactly where she was meant to be, using her strengths to make a difference in her community. In addition to the new job, Ebony found herself the object of media attention. Word had gotten out that Ronaldo had directly intervened to help a waitress who had been unfairly dismissed. Journalists were hungry for the story. At first, Ebony felt overwhelmed by the cameras and questions. She worried about how her former colleagues would react, or if Troy would retaliate somehow. But Ronaldo's PR team carefully shielded her from the worst of the media frenzy, and Ebony soon learned how to navigate interviews with poise. The public narrative was one of inspiration. A woman who lost her job for doing the right thing, then got an amazing opportunity thanks to a celebrity's intervention. What touched Ebony the most was the outpouring of support she received from strangers. Some people messaged her on social media to share their own stories of unfair job loss or workplace discrimination. Others praised her for treating people, especially celebrities, with respect and kindness. Ebony realized that what had happened to her was far from unique. Many people face harsh treatment at their workplace for reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to do the job. By sharing her journey, she hoped to shed light on the importance of empathy, fairness, and understanding in any work environment. During one of her first community events, Ebony helped organize a football clinic for disadvantaged youth. She worked tirelessly, ensuring every child had proper equipment, refreshments, and encouragement from volunteer coaches. When Ronaldo showed up to surprise the kids, the look on their faces was pure joy and excitement. They lined up eagerly, waiting for a chance to kick the ball around with a sports legend. Ebony stood on the sidelines wearing a bright smile. She remembered how nervous she'd been serving him at the diner, never imagining that weeks later she'd be collaborating with him to bring joy to these children. That moment, seeing their laughter and the awe in their eyes, made every hardship worth it. Eventually, Ebony's mother and younger sister flew to Manchester for a visit. They wanted to see Ebony's new workplace and meet some of her colleagues. Ebony proudly gave them a tour of the facility, explaining the programs they were implementing and pointing out the flyers for upcoming events. Her mother, who had worked so hard to give her daughters opportunities, looked at Ebony with shining pride. She told her, "This is what happens when you lead with kindness, my girl. Life found a way to reward you for doing the right thing." The day Ebony's mother and sister were scheduled to return home, Ronaldo arranged a parting gift for them. He took them on a short tour of Old Trafford, allowing them a behind-the-scenes look at one of England's most iconic stadiums. Ebony's mother was thrilled, snapping pictures at every opportunity. Ebony's sister, who had grown up idolizing professional footballers, was speechless when Ronaldo himself offered a quick greeting. The experience cemented Ebony's gratitude for this miraculous twist of fate. Still, Ebony never forgot the sting of being fired unjustly. She tried to maintain a balanced perspective, knowing that not everyone who experiences such injustice gets a fairy tale ending. She used her story to encourage others, visiting job fairs and speaking about perseverance. She told people that even in the darkest moments, they should keep treating others with respect and kindness, because the goodness they put into the world can come back in the most unexpected ways. Months turned into a year. Under Ebony's guidance, the charitable initiative grew, reaching more neighborhoods and forging partnerships with local businesses. She stayed in contact with some of her former co-workers from the diner who told her that Troy continued to run the place with an iron fist, but that Pemberton's was losing customers after word got out about how Ebony had been treated. A few waitresses even approached Ebony for advice about other job opportunities, and she was happy to connect them with resources. Occasionally, Ebony wrestled with whether she should confront Troy or publicly denounce his actions, but she decided against it, believing that her energy was better spent focusing on the positive path her life had taken. The best kind of justice, she reasoned, was living a fulfilling, purposeful life while helping others succeed. She didn't need to stoop to revenge or bitterness. One afternoon, out of pure curiosity, Ebony walked past the diner to see how things were going. She peered in through the window. The sight that met her eyes was a nearly empty establishment with Troy pacing behind the counter, visibly upset. Ebony felt a mixture of pity and resolve. She remembered how helpless and humiliated she had felt on her last day there. Now, she was a confident woman who had found a place where her kindness was valued, not punished. She said a quiet farewell to that chapter of her life and continued walking, her head held high. By the end of that day, Ebony found herself reflecting on the improbable sequence of events that had changed her life. Fired one moment, terrified of how she'd pay the bills, and then receiving a phone call that would transform everything. She marveled at how quickly fortunes could shift, how acts of cruelty could be overturned by acts of generosity. No part of her felt arrogant or self-satisfied. She recognized how fortunate she was. Many people face similar injustices, but never found a benevolent superstar to extend a helping hand. Because of that, Ebony vowed to never take her new role for granted. She channeled her energy into each program, advocating tirelessly for overlooked communities. She threw herself into planning job fairs, scholarship funds, and sports clinics, forging alliances with local charities and educational institutions. Ronaldo's foundation provided resources and clout, but it was Ebony who infused the work with warmth and genuine concern for those they served. Slowly, she built a reputation in the community as someone who cared, someone who listened, and someone who strived to create real change. All the while, she cherished her connection with Ronaldo and his team. She never treated him as an ATM or a miracle worker. Instead, she saw him as a caring individual who used his platform for good, and she made sure to uphold the values that had led him to hire her in the first place. Their relationship was rooted in mutual respect. She saw him as a mentor, and he saw her as an invaluable part of his philanthropic efforts. As her career progressed, Ebony realized that losing her job at the diner had been the catalyst she needed to discover her true calling. Every time she handed a young person a new uniform for a sports program, every time she scheduled a community workshop, every time she saw a smile on a child's face, she remembered that afternoon when she lost everything, only to gain so much more. She carried that memory with her, using it as fuel to remain humble and empathetic in all her dealings. In quiet moments at her modest but now more comfortable apartment, Ebony often thought about how quickly life can change. She remembered stepping off the bus that day, tears in her eyes, with no idea what her future held. She had felt powerless. Now she was a figure of hope in her community, someone people turned to when they faced challenges. She was training others in customer service, not in a trivial sense, but in a broader, more human sense, teaching them the importance of compassion, listening, and respect, regardless of a person's background, status, or fame. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the waitress being fired for helping Ronaldo? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.